The alarm on my console did not blink. It did not need to. On my ship, alarms only sound when something has already gone wrong beyond repair, and this was the first time in my entire career that I heard one during a routine orbital scan of a planet we had already declared harmless. My name is Viel. I am a tactical assessor of the Corin fleet, and I have spent 140 cycles studying species before we decide whether they live free, live controlled, or stop existing as an independent culture at all. I am not a soldier, I am a reader of patterns. My work is to look at a civilization, measure it against thousands of others we have absorbed, and tell the Council exactly what kind of threat it represents, if any. I tell you this so you understand something important before this story truly begins. I was not afraid of humans. Nobody was. Fear was not a word that applied to the planet called Earth in any council report, in any private conversation, in any strategic assumption we carried into their solar system. We were amused by them, mildly curious about them, and completely, catastrophically wrong about them. The vote to invade happened on a day that felt like every other day of my service. I sat in the long, curved briefing chamber of the council vessel Ashenreach, surrounded by representatives from 11 allied worlds, watching a species classification report scroll across the central display. Earth. Third planet, yellow star system, designated for review after an automated deep scan probe recorded something the analysts called an anomaly. The anomaly was simple. Humanity's technological growth rate, measured over just the last 2 of their own centuries, did not follow the curve every other species in galactic history had followed. Every civilization we had ever catalogued grew in a smooth, predictable arc. Slow discovery, careful application, gradual improvement, generation after generation, century after century. Humanity's curve looked like nothing we had a name for. It looked less like growth and more like an explosion that refused to stop expanding. That single fact was enough to trigger an automatic threat review, not because humans were currently dangerous. By every physical and military measure available to us, they were embarrassingly behind. Their strongest militaries fought each other over resources, ideology, and borders, instead of exploring the stars. Their strongest scientists still argued among themselves instead of unifying their knowledge. Their strongest leaders could not agree on anything for more than a season before infighting tore the agreement apart. On paper, humanity looked like a species too busy fighting itself to ever become a threat to anyone else. But the Council does not fear what a species is today. The Council fears what a species might become tomorrow, and that curve, that impossible, steepening curve, was the only thing anyone in that chamber wanted to discuss. I remember the exact words used by Commander Isolt Vray, the presiding officer for that session. She said humanity represented a Tier 3 emerging threat, not because of strength, but because of trajectory. If left alone for another 2 or 3 of their own centuries, the models suggested Earth could reach a technological level capable of contesting Council space directly. Nobody wanted to take that risk. Nobody wanted to be the generation that let a spark become a fire. The vote itself took less time than the debate that came before it. 206 representatives voted in favor of a controlled invasion. 14 abstained. Only 1 voted against it. That one voice belonged to an old council member named Thren, a historian from a species that had studied conquered civilizations for longer than my own people had existed. Thren stood, and the chamber went quiet out of respect rather than agreement, because everyone assumed his objection would be procedural, a formality, nothing more. Instead, he said something I did not understand until it was far too late to matter. He said we were measuring the wrong things. He said a species that fights itself constantly is not a weak species. It is a species that has never stopped training. He said every war humanity had ever fought against itself was, in his words, unintentional preparation for a war none of them knew was coming. He asked the chamber to consider one uncomfortable question before authorizing the invasion. What happens when a species that has spent its entire history fighting each other finally has a single enemy to fight together? Commander Vray thanked him for his input, noted his objection for the official record, and moved the vote to ratification. I will admit something honestly, because this story deserves honesty more than it deserves my pride. I laughed quietly to myself when Thryn sat back down, not out of cruelty, but out of the simple confidence every officer in that room shared. We had conquered species with energy weapons. We had conquered species with hive minds. We had conquered species that could alter matter with focused thought. Humanity had none of that. Humanity had chemical rockets, unstable political alliances, and weapons that still relied on burning fuel to fly. I was assigned as lead tactical assessor for the invasion fleet 3 days later. My duty was to embed with the primary command staff, analyze human resistance patterns in real time, and adjust council strategy as the operation unfolded. It was, by every measure available to me at the time, the easiest assignment of my career. I remember telling a colleague, a logistics officer named Perrin, that this campaign would likely be resolved within a single human season, with minimal losses on either side, because our protocol was built for exactly this kind of controlled, low-resistance operation. Protocol, for those unfamiliar with council procedure, is not a suggestion. It is not a guideline officers interpret loosely depending on circumstance. Protocol is a precise, tested sequence of actions, refined over centuries of successful invasions, designed to minimize casualties on both sides while securing a target world as efficiently as possible. Step 1. Establish an orbital presence strong enough to demonstrate overwhelming capability without provoking unnecessary escalation. Step 2. Broadcast a formal notice of intent, offering the target species a chance to organize a structured, dignified surrender. Step 3. If surrender is not achieved through diplomacy, begin controlled ground operations targeting infrastructure rather than population centers, forcing capitulation through strategic pressure instead of destruction. Every species we had ever encountered had followed some version of this sequence toward the same conclusion. Some resisted longer than others. Some negotiated better terms than others, but the outcome was never in question. The outcome was simply a matter of time and patience, and protocol had never once failed to deliver it. As our fleet approached the outer edge of humanity's solar system, I ran the standard predictive models one final time before we crossed into position. The numbers were almost boring in their consistency. 94% probability of formal surrender negotiations within 30 of their days, 98% probability of full planetary compliance within 1 of their years, estimated council casualties, statistically insignificant. I remember looking at those numbers and feeling something I now recognize as a quiet, comfortable arrogance. I had studied dozens of species in my career, some far more advanced than humanity, and none of them had ever broken those predictions by more than a small margin. There was no reason to believe humanity would be any different. There was a young officer serving under me during that approach, a communications specialist named Doran, barely out of his training cycle. He asked me a question I brushed aside far too quickly, a question I now wish I had taken seriously from the very beginning. He asked whether it concerned me that humanity had never lost a war on their own planet to an outside force. I told him that was because they had never faced an outside force before. He said that was exactly his point. Every species we had ever conquered had, at some point in their history, been conquered by something else first, some other empire, some rival civilization, some natural disaster that taught them the lesson of what it means to lose everything. Humanity, according to every record our scouts had gathered, had never truly experienced that. Every war they had fought had been against each other, on their own terms, using knowledge only they possessed about their own strengths and weaknesses. I told him that made them predictable, not dangerous. I told him a species with no experience losing to an outside force was a species with no experience defending against one either. I believed that with complete confidence as our fleet crossed the final threshold into their solar system and began broadcasting the standard notice of intent toward a small, blue, unremarkable planet that had no idea it was about to become the most expensive miscalculation in Council history. The broadcast went out exactly as protocol required. Clear terms, translated into every major human language our linguistic teams had gathered, offering structured surrender in exchange for continued autonomy over daily life, culture, and internal governance, provided all military infrastructure and advanced research came under council oversight. We expected panic. We expected fractured, contradictory responses from a species famous for disagreeing with itself over nearly everything. We expected, at the very least, some noticeable disruption in human communication networks as governments scrambled to understand what had just arrived above their world. What we received instead was silence. Not confused silence, not frightened silence. A strange, deliberate quiet that our analysts could not immediately explain, broken only by scattered military communications that our systems intercepted and translated in fragments. No mass surrender broadcasts. No desperate pleas for negotiation. No visible collapse of order on the surface below us. I remember standing in the observation deck of our command vessel, watching the planet turn slowly beneath us, and feeling the first, faint stirring of something I did not yet have a name for. It was not fear. Fear would come later, and it would come for reasons far more specific than a quiet planet refusing to answer a broadcast on schedule. It was simply the sense that we had expected a particular kind of response, based on centuries of consistent data from dozens of other worlds, and humanity had not given it to us. I told myself it meant nothing. I told myself every species processes contact differently, and a delayed response was well within the range of normal behavior our models accounted for. I told the command staff the same thing when they asked for my assessment, and I believed it when I said it. I did not know, standing on that observation deck, that I was watching the very first data point in a pattern that would eventually force the Council to rewrite everything it believed about how to measure a threat. I did not know that the silence beneath us was not confusion at all, but something closer to a species, quietly, calmly, deciding exactly how it intended to fight back. All I knew, in that moment, was that protocol said this campaign should already be moving toward a peaceful resolution, and instead, for the first time in longer than I could remember, the numbers on my screen had stopped making sense. The silence lasted for 6 of their days before it broke, and when it broke in a way none of our models had prepared us for. Our fleet held position in orbit, monitoring surface activity through every sensor array we had available. Protocol required patience during this stage, a controlled waiting period designed to let a target species absorb the reality of contact before we move toward the next phase of operations. I used those 6 days to study everything I could about the species beneath us, hoping to understand why the initial response had deviated so sharply from our predictions. What I found, buried in centuries of human history our scout probes had gathered long before the invasion vote, was a pattern I had never seen in any other species we had ever catalogued. Humanity did not organize around a single government, a single military structure, or a single unified culture. They organized around hundreds of competing nations, each with its own leadership, its own military doctrine, its own deeply held beliefs about how the world should function. By every measure we understood, this should have made them weaker, not stronger. A fractured species should collapse faster under external pressure, not slower. But as I studied their history in greater depth, a different picture began to form. These nations, despite constant disagreement with each other, shared something almost every unified species we had conquered did not. They shared practice. Endless, repeated practice at conflict, negotiation, deception, alliance, betrayal, and recovery. Where other species had spent centuries in relative internal peace before encountering an external threat, humanity had spent its entire recorded history in a near-constant state of internal tension, learning lessons about survival that no textbook could have taught them. I did not fully understand the significance of that pattern yet. I only understood that it was different, and different, in my line of work, is a word that should always be followed by caution. On the 7th day, our sensors detected the first organized human military response, and it did not come in the shape protocol had trained us to expect. Every previous species we had encountered responded to overwhelming orbital presence by consolidating their forces, gathering their strongest military assets into defensible positions and attempting some form of coordinated resistance against the most obvious points of our approaching ground operations. It was a predictable pattern, and protocol had specific countermeasures built for exactly that kind of response. Humanity did not consolidate. Humanity scattered. Small mobile units began moving across dozens of countries simultaneously, avoiding major population centers, avoiding predictable formations, avoiding anything that resembled the kind of concentrated defense our tactical models expected. Our analysts initially interpreted this as disorganization, further evidence that competing human nations were failing to cooperate even in the face of an external threat. I remember reviewing the early surface engagement reports with a growing unease I could not yet justify with hard data. A Council reconnaissance unit had been sent to secure a communications facility in a region our maps labeled as lightly defended, standard procedure, low risk, the kind of operation completed successfully hundreds of times on other worlds without incident. The unit did not return. Not destroyed in open conflict, not overwhelmed by superior firepower, simply gone, their last transmission describing unexpected resistance from what appeared to be a small group of armed civilians who had somehow anticipated their exact approach route and timing. I want to be clear about something, because this detail matters more than it might seem. Our scanning technology, our satellite coverage, our communication intercepts, all of it was significantly more advanced than anything humanity possessed. There was no logical way for that small group to have known our unit's precise route unless they had made an educated guess based on terrain and available approach paths and made it correctly. That was the moment I first began seriously questioning our assumptions. I brought my concerns to Commander Vray during a strategy briefing 3 days later, presenting the pattern I had noticed across nearly a dozen similar incidents. Human resistance was not failing to organize. It was organizing differently, favoring small, independent, highly adaptive units over large centralized forces, using terrain knowledge and unpredictable movement instead of direct confrontation. Commander Vray listened carefully, as she always did, but her response reflected the confidence shared by nearly every officer on our command staff at that stage of the campaign. She reminded me that scattered resistance, however clever, could not indefinitely resist a coordinated invasion force with orbital superiority. She reminded me that protocol accounted for guerrilla tactics in its later phases, and that patience would resolve the issue as it always had. I accepted her assessment because I had no better alternative to offer at the time. I had noticed something strange, but I did not yet have enough evidence to challenge protocol itself. The ground campaign expanded over the following weeks, and with it came a flood of data that painted an increasingly uncomfortable picture. Human casualty rates during direct engagements were higher than our own in several documented instances, a statistic almost unheard of when Council forces engaged a technologically inferior species. Our advanced weaponry, our superior armor, our tactical training, none of it seemed to translate into the overwhelming advantage our models predicted. I began interviewing captured personnel whenever possible, hoping to understand the psychology behind their resistance. Most refused to cooperate, which was expected, but one conversation with a young human soldier named Daniel Hurst, captured after a failed attempt to disable one of our supply convoys, changed the way I understood this species more than any data report ever could. Daniel was wounded when we brought him in, his leg damaged badly enough that our medical staff estimated he should have been unable to walk without significant pain. Yet he had continued moving, continued fighting, continued attempting to complete his mission even after his unit was compromised and his escape route cut off. I asked him, through a translator, why he had not simply surrendered once his position became hopeless. His answer stayed with me long after that conversation ended. He said giving up was not something that occurred to him as an option worth considering. He said his people had spent generations teaching each other, sometimes through cruelty and sometimes through cooperation, that survival belonged to those who kept moving forward, even when the odds said they shouldn't. He said every human child grows up hearing stories about people who refuse to quit, against impossible circumstances, and that those stories were not just entertainment, they were instructions. I remember asking him if he was afraid of dying. He looked at me for a long moment before answering, and his answer was simple enough that I have never forgotten it. He said fear was something you feel before you decide what to do about it, not something that decides for you. That conversation marked a turning point in my personal understanding of this campaign, though I would not fully appreciate its significance for several more weeks. I began pulling deeper historical records, studying not just humanity's military conflicts, but their disasters, their recoveries, their patterns of behavior when faced with overwhelming hardship. What I found disturbed me in a way I struggled to articulate to my superiors, because it contradicted everything protocol had taught me to expect from a target species. Every other civilization we had catalogued responded to catastrophic pressure with a predictable curve of decline. Morale would drop, cooperation would fracture, and eventually, resistance would collapse under the accumulated weight of loss and exhaustion. It was a pattern so consistent across dozens of species that protocol had built entire strategic phases around exploiting it. Humanity's historical records showed something closer to the opposite. Disasters that should have ended entire nations instead produced periods of intense unification and innovation. Wars that should have permanently crippled their societies instead became foundations for rapid technological and social advancement in the decades that followed. It was as though pressure did not simply test this species, it actively accelerated it. I compiled my findings into a formal report and submitted it to command, requesting a reassessment of our operational timeline before continuing further ground engagements. I explained that our current strategy, built entirely on protocol designed for species that weaken under pressure, might be fundamentally unsuited for a species that appeared to strengthen because of it. The report was acknowledged, filed, and largely set aside. Command's official response reminded me that isolated incidents of unusual resistance, however concerning individually, did not yet represent a statistically significant deviation from expected outcomes. Protocol required patience and continued pressure, not premature strategic revision based on limited data. I understood their caution. Protocol had succeeded across dozens of previous campaigns precisely because officers trusted its structure instead of reacting emotionally to isolated setbacks. I told myself my concerns were simply the natural anxiety of an assessor encountering something unfamiliar for the first time in a long career. But as the weeks continued, the isolated incidents stopped being isolated. Human resistance groups began coordinating across previously competing nations in ways our intelligence had not predicted. Communication networks we believed disrupted continued functioning through methods our analysts struggled to fully trace. Supply lines we considered secure suffered repeated, precisely timed disruptions that suggested a level of planning far beyond what scattered, disorganized resistance should have been capable of achieving. I remember a particular incident that shifted the mood of our entire command staff, not because of its scale, but because of what it revealed about human adaptability. A council research outpost, established to study captured human technology, was compromised not through direct assault, but through a small group of engineers who had studied our own equipment closely enough to disable its security systems using improvised tools built from salvaged materials. Within days, information about our defensive weaknesses had spread through human resistance networks faster than our own internal reports could be distributed through official channels. It was the first time I heard genuine uncertainty in Commander Vray's voice during a staff briefing. She did not abandon protocol. She would never abandon protocol without direct council authorization. But she began asking questions she had not asked before, questions about contingency planning, about worst-case projections, about what our strategy would look like if humanity's resistance continued escalating instead of collapsing as expected. I did not have complete answers for her yet. All I had were patterns, a growing collection of data points that, taken individually, seemed manageable, but taken together, painted a picture of a species adapting to our presence faster than any civilization we had ever encountered. Doran, The young communications officer who had asked me that uncomfortable question before we ever entered their solar system, found me during a quiet moment between briefings. He did not say anything triumphant or accusing. He simply asked whether I remembered our earlier conversation about species that had never lost a war to an outside force. I told him I remembered. He asked if I thought that still mattered. I did not have an answer for him then. I only knew that the confident, comfortable arrogance I had carried into this campaign had begun to erode, replaced by a quiet, growing unease that Protocol, for the first time in Council history, might be facing a species it was never designed to fully understand. By the time the second month of ground operations began, I had stopped trusting the predictive models I once relied on, without question. Every projection I built using standard Council formulas produced numbers that looked correct on the surface, but consistently failed to match what actually happened once human resistance groups became involved. I began building a separate set of models entirely, ones that accounted for behavior our official protocol did not recognize as possible. The first thing I noticed, once I stopped forcing human behavior into the shape of previous conquered species, was how quickly this civilization learned. Not individually, though individual learning was already faster than expected, but collectively. A tactic that worked against one resistance group in one region would appear, in modified and improved form, in a completely different region within days, sometimes hours. There was no central command coordinating this spread. There didn't need to be. Humanity had spent its entire history building networks of shared knowledge, informal and formal, and those networks adapted to wartime conditions faster than our intelligence teams could map them. I remember presenting this finding to a joint session of command officers, using a specific example to illustrate the pattern. A resistance cell in a mountainous region had discovered a method of using our own scanning frequencies against us, creating brief blind spots in our surveillance coverage using improvised equipment built from salvaged Council technology and human civilian electronics. Within 11 days, similar methods had appeared in resistance activity across 4 other continents, each version slightly refined from the last, as though the tactic itself was evolving through repeated use. One of the senior tactical officers in that meeting, a veteran of over 30 successful campaigns named Threll, dismissed my findings with the same confidence I once carried myself. He argued that coincidence and convergent problem-solving could explain isolated similarities without requiring any coordinated intelligence sharing between resistance groups. He reminded the room that Protocol had survived far more chaotic campaigns than this one, and that panic over unconfirmed patterns served no strategic purpose. I did not argue with him directly, because I understood his position came from genuine experience rather than ignorance. But I asked him one question that I believe stayed with him longer than he admitted. I asked him to name one other species, in the entire history of Council conquest, that had improved its resistance tactics at this rate, without any centralized command structure directing the effort. He could not answer, because there wasn't one. The ground campaign continued to expand, and with it came a phenomenon our psychological assessment teams struggled to categorize using existing frameworks. Human morale, rather than declining under sustained pressure as every previous conquered species had, appeared to be strengthening. Civilian populations that should have been overwhelmed by fear instead began organizing local support networks, sharing resources, hiding resistance fighters, and passing information through channels our surveillance struggled to fully penetrate. I began studying this behavior more closely, trying to understand its root cause, and found myself returning again and again to humanity's own historical record. I studied their accounts of past conflicts among themselves, disasters that had struck their communities, moments in their history when entire populations faced circumstances that should have broken their will to continue. In nearly every case, the pattern repeated itself. Pressure did not simply fail to break them. It seemed to activate something deeply embedded in how this species organized itself when survival was at stake. A field report crossed my desk during this period that I still think about, even now. A Council patrol unit had entered a small human settlement expecting minimal resistance, based on population size and lack of any known military infrastructure in the area. Instead, they found the entire settlement had organized a coordinated defense using nothing more than farming equipment, hunting tools, and knowledge of their own terrain passed down through generations. The patrol unit suffered losses significant enough that command temporarily suspended operations in that entire region pending further analysis. What struck me most about that report was not the resistance itself, but the testimony from surviving unit members afterward. They described the settlement's defenders as calm, coordinated, and disturbingly patient, waiting for precisely the right moment to act, rather than panicking or acting rashly under pressure. This was not the behavior of a frightened, disorganized civilian population. This was the behavior of a species that had, somewhere in its long and violent history, learned exactly how to organize itself when threatened, even without formal military training. I brought this concern directly to Commander Vray during a private session, away from the wider command staff, because I wanted to speak candidly without the pressure of maintaining official confidence in front of subordinate officers. I told her that our fundamental assumption about this campaign, that humanity represented a technologically inferior species that would eventually capitulate under sustained pressure, might be built on a dangerous misunderstanding of what actually made a civilization dangerous. I explained that technological capability was only one measure of threat, and perhaps not even the most important one. Adaptability, resilience under pressure, and the capacity to learn and improve faster than an opponent could counter. These were qualities Council doctrine had never fully weighted in its threat assessments because no previous species had displayed them at this scale. Every civilization we had encountered either possessed advanced technology and crumbled under pressure, or lacked advanced technology and crumbled even faster. Humanity was demonstrating something our models simply had no category for, a species with limited technology that refused to crumble at all, and instead used every setback as an opportunity to improve. Commander Vray listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she asked me a question that revealed she had been quietly reaching similar conclusions on her own. She asked what I believed would happen if this pattern continued unchecked for another several months. I told her honestly that I did not know, because nothing in Council history gave me a comparable scenario to reference. Every previous campaign that involved sustained resistance eventually showed measurable signs of exhaustion, resource depletion, or fractured coordination among defending forces. Humanity showed none of these signs. If anything, their coordination was improving, their tactics were becoming more refined, and their morale, based on every intercepted communication our teams had gathered, remained remarkably stable despite mounting losses. She asked me to prepare a formal report for Council review, outlining these concerns in detail, with supporting data drawn from the patterns I had been tracking. I spent the following days compiling everything I had observed, cross-referencing it against historical Council data from every previous campaign in our records, building the most thorough analysis of my career. The report's central finding was simple to state, but difficult to fully accept. Every species Council forces had ever encountered followed a broadly similar growth curve throughout their technological and social development, a slow, steady, linear progression shaped by internal stability and gradual external pressure. Humanity's growth curve, when I finally modeled it properly using variables our standard formulas ignored, was not linear at all. It was exponential, and more troubling still, it appeared directly correlated to conflict itself. The more humanity fought, whether against each other historically or against us now, the faster their capabilities seemed to compound. I included a specific projection in that report, one that I knew would be controversial, but one I believed was too important to omit. If humanity's current rate of tactical and technological adaptation continued at its observed pace, our forces could expect resistance capability to potentially double within a matter of months, not years, a timeline utterly incompatible with protocol's assumption of gradual, manageable escalation. While that report worked its way through official channels toward full Council review, the ground campaign continued, and it was during this period that everything shifted from concerning to catastrophic. A major operation had been planned to secure a strategically significant coastal region, an operation involving a substantial portion of our available ground forces, supported by orbital coordination and advanced Council weaponry. By every calculation available to our command staff, this operation should have succeeded with minimal resistance, given the resources committed and the relatively limited defensive infrastructure our scans had detected in the region beforehand. What our scans had failed to detect was the extent of human coordination happening beneath the surface, quite literally in some cases, as resistance forces had spent weeks constructing underground networks our sensors struggled to fully penetrate. When our forces moved into position, they encountered not the scattered, disorganized resistance our models predicted, but a coordinated, multi-layered defense that had clearly been planned with detailed knowledge of our tactical doctrine. I was present in the command center during that operation, monitoring real-time data as it unfolded, and I remember the exact moment the mood in that room shifted from confidence to disbelief. Reports came in describing captured Council equipment being used against our own forces, communication jamming techniques our engineers had never encountered, and coordinated strikes against supply lines that suggested detailed advanced knowledge of our deployment schedule. The operation, intended to be a decisive demonstration of Council superiority, ended instead in a significant tactical failure. An entire task force was effectively neutralized, not destroyed in the traditional sense, but rendered combat ineffective through a combination of captured technology, superior local knowledge, and coordinated timing that our own forces struggled to match. Council casualties from that single operation exceeded the combined total from every previous engagement of the campaign up to that point. The silence in the command center after the final reports came in was unlike anything I had experienced in my career. Officers who had entered this campaign with absolute confidence in protocol's proven methodology sat staring at data that simply refused to make sense within the framework they had trusted their entire professional lives. I remember Commander Vray standing at the center of that room, reading through the final casualty reports, without speaking for what felt like an unusually long time. When she finally addressed the staff, her voice carried none of the calm authority I had grown accustomed to hearing from her. She ordered an immediate suspension of further large-scale ground operations pending a full strategic review, a decision that, under normal Council procedure, required direct authorization from command levels far above her own position. That evening, alone in my quarters, I reviewed the data from that failed operation again and again, searching for some explanation I might have missed, some detail that would restore my confidence in the assumptions I had carried into this campaign. I found none. What I found instead was confirmation of everything my earlier reports had warned about, now demonstrated at a scale too significant for command to continue dismissing. Doran found me there later that night, having heard about the operation's outcome through official channels. He did not gloat, and he did not seem satisfied by being proven right about his earlier concerns. He simply sat with me quietly for a while before asking what I thought would happen next. I told him honestly that I no longer knew. Protocol had guided every Council military operation for centuries, refined through countless successful campaigns against dozens of other species. It had never faced a civilization that grew stronger the more it was tested, that treated every defeat as a lesson rather than an ending, that seemed almost biologically wired to resist collapse under circumstances that had broken every other species we had ever encountered. I told him that for the first time in my career, I genuinely did not know whether our strategy could still succeed, and worse, I was beginning to suspect that protocol itself, the very foundation of everything the Council believed about how invasions were supposed to work, had simply never been designed to handle an opponent like this one. Doran asked if that frightened me. I thought about Daniel Hurst's answer to that same question weeks earlier, about fear being something you feel before deciding what to do about it. I told Doran that yes, it frightened me, but more than that, it fascinated me, because I was watching something happen that no officer in Council history had ever documented before, a species discovering, in real time, exactly how dangerous it could become when finally given a single, unified reason to fight. I did not yet know how right that observation would prove to be, or how completely it would unravel everything the Council believed about the nature of true strength. The strategic review Commander Vray ordered did not stay confined to our command staff for long. Within days, word of the failed coastal operation reached the Council directly, and with it came a level of scrutiny our campaign had not experienced since the original vote to invade. I was summoned, along with several other senior officers, to present findings through a secure communication link to a special session convened specifically to address what Council representatives were now calling, with visible discomfort, an unexpected complication. I remember preparing for that session with more care than I had given any previous report in my career, knowing that whatever I presented would shape decisions affecting thousands of lives on both sides of this conflict. I organized my data carefully, built clear visual models of humanity's adaptation curve, and prepared myself to defend conclusions I knew would be difficult for many in that chamber to accept. The session began with a summary of the campaign's official status, presented by Commander Vray herself. She described the coastal operations failure honestly, without minimizing the scale of our losses, and outlined the immediate steps taken to suspend further large-scale offensives pending strategic reassessment. I watched the reactions of Council representatives as she spoke, and saw the same expression repeated across dozens of faces, a mixture of confusion and disbelief that a Tier 3 threat, a species with no advanced military technology, no unified command structure, and no history of interstellar conflict, could inflict this kind of damage on a properly executed Council operation. When it came time for my portion of the briefing, I presented the adaptation curve I had built, showing humanity's growth in resistance capability plotted against every previous species Council forces had ever engaged. The visual difference was stark enough that it required no additional explanation. Every other species formed a smooth, gradually declining line as resistance weakened under sustained pressure. Humanity's line climbed steadily upward, with no signs of leveling off. I explained the underlying theory as clearly as I could, knowing how unconventional it would sound to officers trained entirely within protocol's established framework. I explained that humanity's centuries of internal conflict, rather than representing weakness or disorganization as our original threat assessment assumed, had instead functioned as an extended period of continuous tactical and psychological training. Every war fought among human nations, every disaster survived, every period of hardship endured, had built a species uniquely prepared to adapt quickly to exactly the kind of pressure our invasion represented. I explained further that this adaptation was not merely technological. Humans were not simply reverse engineering our equipment faster than expected, though that was certainly part of the problem. They were adapting psychologically and organizationally at a rate that defied every assumption built into Council's strategic doctrine. Fractured nations that had spent generations distrusting each other were finding ways to cooperate against a shared threat faster than unified civilizations we had previously conquered ever managed to organize resistance in the first place. A Council representative I did not recognize, from a species known for cautious, methodical decision-making, asked whether I believed this adaptation would eventually plateau, following the pattern every other species had shown once resistance capability reached certain thresholds. It was a fair question, and I wished I had a reassuring answer to offer. I told the chamber honestly that I did not know, because we had no comparable historical data to reference. Every model I had built, using every variable available to me, suggested continued acceleration rather than eventual leveling. I explained that if current trends continued without significant strategic adjustment, Council forces could face resistance capability within the coming months that would make our original invasion force dangerously insufficient for continued operations. The chamber fell into a heavy silence following that statement, broken eventually by Thren, the same historian who had cast the lone dissenting vote against this invasion from the very beginning. He rose slowly, and though age had clearly taken some strength from his voice, the weight of his words carried more authority in that moment than anyone else in the session. He reminded the chamber of his original warning, delivered before a single council ship had ever entered humanity's solar system. He had said we were measuring the wrong things, that a species which had spent its entire history fighting itself was not weak, but constantly training, and that the real danger lay not in what humanity currently possessed, but in what they would become the moment they had a single, unified enemy to focus that training against. He asked the chamber a question that none of us could comfortably answer. He asked how many other species, throughout the history of council expansion, had we assessed using only their current capabilities, while ignoring the deeper patterns hidden within their history. He suggested, gently but firmly, that our entire system of threat classification might contain a fundamental flaw, one that measured strength as a static quantity, rather than understanding it as something that could be actively cultivated through struggle. Commander Vray, to her credit, did not dismiss his concerns as she and others had done during the original vote. She acknowledged that current battlefield evidence supported much of what Thren had warned about, and requested formal guidance on how the Council wished to proceed, given that Protocol's standard escalation procedures assumed a target species would show measurable signs of weakening resolve by this stage of a campaign, a condition humanity had not only failed to meet, but had actively inverted. The debate that followed stretched across hours, longer than any council session I had personally witnessed. Some representatives argued for immediate, overwhelming escalation, believing that humanity's advantage came specifically from the controlled, limited nature of our current operations, and that a full-scale demonstration of true council capability would finally break their resistance before it could grow further. Others argued the opposite, warning that escalation against a species already demonstrating this level of adaptive capability might simply accelerate their growth even further, teaching them lessons at a faster rate through more intense conflict rather than deterring them. I found myself asked directly for my professional recommendation, a request that placed enormous weight on my next words, given how thoroughly my earlier analysis had already reshaped the tone of this entire session. I chose my words carefully, aware that whatever I said would likely influence a decision affecting the future of an entire world. I told the Council that based on everything I had observed, humanity's strength appeared to be directly tied to the intensity of the pressure applied against them. Every escalation in our campaign so far had been met not with growing desperation, but with growing sophistication in their response. I explained my genuine concern that further escalation, rather than breaking their resistance, would simply accelerate a learning process that already appeared to be outpacing our own strategic adjustments. I recommended, as clearly as I could without overstepping my role as an assessor rather than a policymaker, that the Council seriously consider whether continued invasion remained a viable strategy at all, given that every fundamental assumption underlying protocol had proven inaccurate when applied to this particular species. That recommendation did not sit well with everyone in the chamber. Several senior military representatives argued forcefully that abandoning an invasion after suffering losses, however significant, would set a dangerous precedent, potentially inviting future threats from species who might interpret Council withdrawal as weakness rather than caution. Their concerns were not unreasonable. The Council's reputation for overwhelming, unstoppable resolve had discouraged countless potential conflicts throughout our history, simply because other species understood that resisting Council expansion had never once succeeded. Thren responded to this concern with a point that I believe ultimately shifted the direction of the entire session. He asked the assembled representatives to consider which outcome posed a greater long-term risk to Council reputation and strength: a controlled, dignified withdrawal from a campaign that had revealed unexpected complications, or the possibility of continuing to pour resources and lives into a conflict against a species, actively growing stronger with every engagement, potentially resulting in a far more catastrophic and public failure later. While the Council debated, ground operations on Earth continued at a reduced pace, limited primarily to defensive consolidation of our existing positions rather than further offensive expansion. I spent those weeks continuing my analysis, gathering additional data that only reinforced the conclusions I had already presented. Human resistance groups, sensing the reduced pressure, used the pause not to rest, but to further refine their coordination, expand their captured technology programs, and strengthen alliances between previously competing nations. I remember a specific piece of intelligence that reached our command staff during this period, one that illustrated just how far this transformation had progressed. Reports indicated that several major human nations, previously locked in decades of political tension and mutual distrust, had begun openly sharing military intelligence and coordinating joint strategic planning against Council forces, a level of cooperation that our original threat assessment had considered almost impossible given humanity's documented history of internal division. I brought this development to Commander Vray personally, and I remember her response carrying a weight of genuine concern rather than the confident authority she had projected throughout the early stages of this campaign. She acknowledged that if humanity achieved full strategic unification, even temporarily, in direct response to Council pressure, our current force levels would almost certainly prove insufficient to maintain any meaningful control over the planet, regardless of what decision the Council ultimately reached regarding continued operations. It was during this tense period of uncertainty that I received a private communication from Thren himself, an unusual gesture given the significant difference in our respective ranks and roles within Council hierarchy. He thanked me for the thoroughness of my analysis, and shared with me something from his own extensive historical research that I had not previously considered. He explained that throughout the long history of civilizations across the galaxy, the rarest and most dangerous transformation a species could undergo was not technological advancement, but psychological unification born from shared adversity. Most species achieved unity gradually, through centuries of stable governance and cultural development. A small number of species historically had achieved unity suddenly, catalyzed by an external threat significant enough to override generations of internal division. He told me that in every historical case where this kind of sudden unification had occurred, the resulting civilization emerged not just stronger, but fundamentally transformed, carrying forward the adaptive intensity of that crisis long after the original threat had passed. He said if humanity was indeed undergoing this kind of transformation because of our invasion, we were not simply facing a difficult military campaign. We were, without intending to, actively midwifing the birth of a civilization that might eventually become one of the most formidable forces the galaxy had ever encountered. I asked him what he believed the Council should do with that knowledge. His answer was simple, though its implications were anything but. He said the only responsible choice remaining was to withdraw as quickly and carefully as possible, before further conflict accelerated a transformation that might already be beyond our ability to prevent, and to hope that whatever humanity became as a result of this encounter would eventually choose to remember Council restraint rather than Council aggression. I did not know, at the time of that conversation, that his recommendation would soon become the Council's official position. I only knew that the confident, methodical certainty that had defined every stage of this invasion's planning had completely dissolved, replaced by something closer to genuine uncertainty about whether the most powerful interstellar authority in known space had, through careful adherence to proven protocol, inadvertently created exactly the kind of threat it had once believed impossible to produce. The Council's final decision came 6 weeks after that private conversation with Thren, and by the time it arrived, the situation on the ground had shifted so dramatically that the decision felt less like a choice and more like an acknowledgement of something that had already become inevitable. During those 6 weeks, I remained embedded with command staff, watching human resistance capability continue its steady, uninterrupted climb. What began as scattered guerrilla tactics had evolved into something resembling a coordinated, multinational defense network, sharing intelligence, resources, and captured technology across borders that had divided these people for generations. I watched leaders who had spent entire careers opposing each other's policies, appear together in coordinated broadcasts, their disagreements set aside in favor of a shared, singular focus that our original threat assessment had never imagined possible. I interviewed several additional captured personnel during this period, hoping to better understand the internal psychology driving this transformation. One conversation stood out clearly among the rest, with a woman named Olivia Marsh, a former civilian engineer who had become deeply involved in coordinating resistance communication networks across her region. I asked her directly how her people had managed to set aside decades, sometimes centuries, of political and cultural conflict so quickly once our invasion began. Her answer was delivered with a calm certainty that reminded me strongly of Daniel Hurst's earlier response about fear and decision-making. She said her people had never actually needed a reason to unite before, because they had always been too busy competing with each other over resources, ideology, and pride. She said humanity's disagreements were real, but they had never been as fundamental as the disagreements suggested on the surface. Given a threat large enough and clear enough, those old divisions simply stopped mattering, not because they were forgotten, but because everyone involved recognized, almost instinctively, which conflicts actually deserved their attention and which ones did not. She added something that I later shared directly with Commander Vray, because I believed it captured the core of everything our campaign had failed to anticipate. She said humanity had always known how to fight. What they had never had, until we arrived, was universal agreement on exactly who the fight should be against. By the time the Council's final decision arrived, communicated through a formal directive delivered to every Council vessel involved in the campaign, the tone of that message reflected an institution that had been forced to confront the limits of its own understanding in a way it had likely never experienced in its entire history. The directive ordered an immediate, complete withdrawal of all Council forces from Earth's solar system, to be conducted with maximum caution and minimal further engagement wherever possible. It formally reclassified humanity's threat designation, removing the Tier 3 emerging threat status entirely and replacing it with a new classification that, as far as my own research could determine, had never been used in Council history before that moment. Unknown, do not engage. I remember reading that reclassification for the first time and feeling a complicated mixture of relief and unease settle over me. Relief, because it meant an end to a conflict that had already cost far more than anyone anticipated on both sides. Unease, because that new classification represented something the Council had never before been forced to admit, that an entire civilization existed whose true potential could not be reliably measured or predicted using any tool available to us. The withdrawal itself was conducted carefully, following a modified version of protocol designed specifically for this unprecedented circumstance. Council forces retreated from surface positions in stages, prioritizing the safety of retreating personnel over any remaining strategic objectives. I watched, during those final days in orbit, as human resistance groups allowed our withdrawal to proceed without significant additional aggression, a restraint that our psychological assessment teams found almost as unsettling as their earlier resistance had been. I asked Doran during one of our final shared shifts before departure why he thought humanity had chosen restraint during our withdrawal rather than pressing whatever advantage they had built over the course of the campaign. He suggested, and I have come to believe he was largely correct, that humanity understood something about strength that our own Council had only just begun to grasp. True strength did not need to prove itself through unnecessary aggression once its point had already been made. Allowing us to withdraw without further conflict sent a message just as powerful as any additional resistance might have. A message that said clearly, we were capable of more, and chose restraint anyway. I was summoned to testify before a full Council session shortly after our fleet returned to secured Council space, part of a broader effort to formally document the lessons learned from what had already become known throughout Council command structures as the most significant strategic miscalculation in recorded history. Standing before that chamber, surrounded by representatives who had once voted with near unanimous confidence to authorize this invasion, I found myself in the unusual position of explaining not just what had gone wrong tactically, but what had gone wrong in the fundamental philosophy underlying how the Council measured threat in the first place. I told them plainly that humanity had never actually been weak. They had been untested, and our invasion, rather than exploiting a genuine vulnerability, had simply provided the first true test of capabilities this species had been quietly developing throughout their entire violent, complicated, endlessly resilient history. I explained that our protocol, refined over centuries of successful campaigns against dozens of other species, had never encountered a civilization whose primary defining characteristic was the ability to transform hardship into strength at a rate faster than any external force could reasonably counter. I reminded the chamber of Thren's original warning, delivered before a single ship had entered humanity's solar system, and acknowledged openly that if the Council had taken that warning seriously from the beginning, this entire campaign, along with the significant losses it produced on both sides, might have been avoided entirely. A younger representative, clearly troubled by the implications of everything presented during that session, asked a question that I believe reflected the concern shared by nearly everyone in that chamber. She asked what this meant for the Council's future security, now that a species capable of this kind of rapid transformation existed within reach of Council space, no longer contained by internal conflict, and now fully aware that an external threat existed capable of triggering that transformation once again. I did not have a comforting answer for her, because I did not believe a comforting answer existed. I told the chamber honestly that humanity's transformation was likely permanent, or at least long-lasting, given everything historical precedent suggested about species that achieved unity through this kind of shared adversity. I explained that the most responsible path forward was not further aggression, which our own campaign had already proven counterproductive, but careful, respectful distance, allowing this newly unified civilization the space to develop naturally, in hopes that they would eventually choose diplomacy over retaliation once they possessed the capability to consider it. The Council ultimately adopted a formal policy of non-interference regarding Earth, establishing a significant restricted zone around their solar system, monitored quietly from a distance but never approached with anything resembling the military presence our original invasion had brought. It was, by every measure available to us, an unprecedented decision, one that acknowledged openly that the most powerful interstellar authority in known space had encountered something it could not fully control, and had chosen wisdom over pride in response. I requested and received a transfer away from active combat assessment following that final Council session, choosing instead to dedicate my remaining career to studying humanity from a careful, respectful distance, hoping to better understand a transformation that continued to unfold long after our forces withdrew from their solar system. The reports that reached us over the following years, gathered through careful, indirect observation rather than direct contact, described a species continuing to build upon the unity our invasion had inadvertently catalyzed. Nations that had once been locked in generational conflict now cooperated on projects far beyond anything their pre-invasion history suggested was possible. Their technological development, already unusual before our arrival, accelerated further as researchers who had once worked in isolated competition began sharing knowledge freely, driven by lessons learned during a crisis none of them had chosen, but all of them had survived together. I often think back to that original Council session, the one where the vote to invade passed with near total confidence, where Thren's lone warning was acknowledged politely and then dismissed without serious consideration. I think about the quiet arrogance I carried into that campaign myself, certain that centuries of proven protocol could not possibly fail against a species so clearly behind us in every conventional measure of strength. I understand now, in a way I could not have understood before witnessing it directly, that strength is not simply a static quality that can be measured through technology, weaponry, or population size. Strength, for a species like humanity, was something forged through struggle, refined through generations of conflict they had once turned entirely against each other, and finally unleashed, fully and completely, the moment they were given a single, undeniable reason to turn that same intensity towards something greater than themselves. We voted to invade Earth because our data suggested an easy campaign against a fractured, technologically inferior species. Everything about that decision followed protocol precisely, built on centuries of proven success against dozens of other civilizations throughout Council history. What came next? The resilience, the rapid adaptation, the sudden and permanent unification of a species we had fundamentally misunderstood, shattered every assumption the Council had ever held about what truly makes a civilization dangerous. I do not know what humanity will eventually become, now that they have seen clearly what exists beyond their own world, and now that they understand, with absolute certainty, that they possess the capability to face it without breaking. I only know that somewhere among the stars, a species that once fought endlessly among itself has finally discovered a deeper truth about its own nature, one the Council learned far too late, and one I suspect the rest of the galaxy will eventually learn as well. They were never the weak ones. They were simply waiting for a reason strong enough to remind them of exactly what they had always been capable of becoming.